Sorry.
So my name is Brendan McCurdy, and I have the honor of being the president of your library board. I'd like to acknowledge John Patton as a fellow trustee, and I'd like to put Louise, our former trustee, hello, and Alice Lepore, our director. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. I hope very much that you love your new library. We thank you for your support and your tax dollars. We try to put them to good use. And to that end, we put an installation up for all to enjoy, and I'm going to turn it over to Connie Currie, who, as you may know, is president of the Sayville Historical Society.
Thank you very much. I also want to thank you very much for coming. It's really a nice group here. You know, the thing with something like this is, as the years go by, the crowds become smaller and smaller. I'm beginning to really realize that. And but we are still, it's nice that we still have been able to get a nice group out for the old school. Back when the fire destroyed the school, the Sayville Historical Society was given the charge of the sign, of the pediment. And we had it we had it actually outside. We had it on one of the buildings for a long time. We then decided, because it was starting to look not so good, we brought her in, and then we had her restored. And when we didn't know what we were going to do with it, whether we were just going to keep her in storage or what. But when the library finally was able to move here, and Alice had said something about the possibility of having it here, it was perfect, because actually what she's done is she's come home. And this is where she should be. It's where, and it's wonderful. You know, the children today, we try to teach them, and this is wonderful for them, because they're going to come in here and they're going to look at this and they're going to say, what is that, you know? And then we can tell them what it is and tell them what was here. We had a taping a couple, maybe 10, 15 years ago. We had people come together to talk about Old 88. And I think one of the most moving parts of the entire thing, and we have it on tape, was that the daughter of the fire chief, who was here who was at the fire, she was with him. And when the water started to pour out of the building and down, her father said to her, "The building is gone." And she said they just stood there and they cried. And when you listen to the tape, you can hear the people crying on the tape. So this is a very, very moving thing. And so shall we cut the...
Yes, we're going to cut it, and please know we have some refreshments and such afterwards over in our children's craft room, and we're going to invite anyone who has memories of Old 88, good, bad, or indifferent. We'd like to get it on tape, so we're going to invite you, please don't be bashful, and record your thoughts and your memories, so we have them for all time.
That's wonderful.
Now, this is going to be a little tricky. We're not so much going to...
We do not want to be buried in the
The plan is that Connie and I are going to cut this string simultaneously at the same time.
Okay.
And this is just going to fall. So it's not going to have quite the dramatic effect.
My leg is on that way.
We're going to cut right above the... Right there. Sound good? Don't have to go too hard. So on 3, 1, 2, 3.
Oh, well, one more thing. I almost forgot.
I went there, yeah.
What Brendan
I think that was the
would
last
like
class.
to have from the Sayville Historical Society is the picture of the building with its history, so that it can be kept with the pediment, and that will explain this.
Let me read this, everybody. I'm sure you're interested. It says, Old 88. In 1888, local architect Isaac H. Greene, Jr. designed this all-grade school, which was erected by local builder Robert Nunn's. It was equipped with the latest technology, including central heat and large windows for ventilation.
Windows are open.
In 1895, a battery-operated bell system was installed, so the staff and students knew when it was time for recitations, lunch, and the most favorite bell, dismissal. I added that. The school had a distinctive bell tower, which contained the bell from the earlier 1859 school. During both World Wars, the tower was used as a lookout for spotting enemy planes. Men, women, and children gave their time to this cause. The building served as a school until 1958. It was then leased to Adelphi, Suffolk. When the college left, the Sayville School District used Old 88 for their administrative offices until faulty wiring caused a fire that destroyed the building in 1969. The pediment mounted above, however, was saved and given to the Sayville Historical Society. It can be seen in this photograph above the main entrance. After the damaged structure was hauled away, the land stood empty for decades. When the library was built on the site of Old 88, the board of Sayville Historical Society offered the pediment for display. It is our pleasure to join the library board today, November 20th, 2011, for the unveiling. Well, I think it looks good. What do you guys think?
I remember, what I really remember about, am I on? Oh, hold on. What I really remember is how much squeaking, how the floors squeaked so much. Because by the time I was there in 58 or whatever it was, by the time I was there, the building was quite old. And the nails had, from the 10 million students who had climbed the stairs over all those years, the fastenings had become loose. And when you walked up the stairs, everything squeaked. It just squeaked and squeaked. And the other thing I remember is it didn't have a cafeteria, of course. No cafeteria. So I was so spoiled at Greene Avenue, which had a wonderful cafeteria. For 20 cents or 30 cents, you got a beautiful meal. As we came over to Old 88 and no meal at all, we had a brown bag. So back then you could walk home for lunch. And I lived on Handsome Avenue, so I occasionally walked home for lunch. But in bad weather, it was brown bag, peanut butter and jelly. And that was a big come down from Greene Avenue. And then the other thing I just remember was the wood. There was just so much wood. It was this enormous pile of wood. And it was a warm, wonderful place. I liked it a lot. I was only there 1 year because then we moved over. I went from 6th grade to 7th grade in the building next door because the high school was just finished then, I guess. And so the high school left the junior high school building, moved up Brook Street, and junior high was the old high school right next door. But anyway, so that's my memory of Old 88. And oh, just one other quick thing. The next year, Adelphi, Suffolk moved in, and I remember they were what we call big kids. They were college students, which we never saw before in our lives, and they wore beanies. College freshmen in the 1950s in America wore beanies, and they had to get them signed by the upperclassmen for, I think, 2 weeks. They had 2 weeks to get signatures all over their beanies. And so in the autumn of my 7th grade, this was a college. Old 88 was a college. Who could have thought that it went from a general elementary school, all-purpose, all-grade school, to a college, and then back to this library in the same spot. So this spot has been a holy place for education and learning, and always will be. Thank you.
Thank you. Memory? Who wants to go? Go ahead.
I'm Bill Powie. I went to kindergarten here in 1936. Sarah Edwards, I believe, was the teacher. And I remember I was allowed to bring my tricycle to school. And we were allowed to ride the tricycles around in the room. And then when we went to first grade, I went to the Tyler Avenue School in West Sayville, 2 grades in a room. Interesting. But then I came back here to the Greene Avenue School for junior high. And some of the classes were in the old 88 building. We had a boys' home ec class way back then. And we learned how to make grilled cheese sandwiches, and I think, and there was a chocolate pudding, stir. But anyhow, that was about the extent that we were allowed to do. And then we had shop in these coops in the back that were in the back, chicken coops we called them. And I had shop classes with Mr. Smith, Charlie Smith. And then I also. Around that time, I was also a spotter up in the tower, airplane spotter, and I had a regular slot that I had to fill. I was with Mrs. Krishnak with that. Just remember that.
That was what year?
I don't know the year of that, and I graduated from Sayville High School in 1947, and my class is going to have their 65th anniversary or reunion next year. Thank you.
I'll follow Chris Bodkin, because Chris was in the class just one class ahead of my son Jack, who was at the, excuse me, old 88. And I picked a bad time. I don't have a cold. But anyway, old 88, I taught there, but that was the last half year that we were in Sayville schools, used Old 88 as a regular school. And the reason I'm remembering it is that in those days you didn't necessarily have to be, have certification in the subject. What you had to do was just fill, I'm okay now, thank you. What you had to do was fill a spot. And they were short of a math teacher in the middle of the year. So they said, come on, Betty, you're going to teach math. So I said, okay. The reason they knew me pretty well was Walter Dickey's, who had been principal of Greene Avenue Elementary School before it was used, and then, of course, during the time it was used, he rented our house in Sayville, which is how I got to know everybody in the winter, and we lived in it in the summer when I was a youngster. So I was in Sayville from 1922 on, but that's the connection. And they knew I had a degree, so I literally didn't even ask for the job in Old 88. They just said, that's where you're going to teach. We're short of a teacher. Luckily, I did pretty well, because then they hired me as a science teacher in the junior high school, which was the old high school, because the old high school had moved to the new high school. I think I better quit.
Then Mrs. Schultz.
Sure. Certainly, my husband knew her quite well,
Mrs.
because he
White.
went to say,
Miss White.
as a student's teacher.
I remember some of the lady teachers.
You remember Mrs. Ennis?
Yes.
She was a strict teacher. And I hit you on the knuckles. She was very strict. And when we had lunch. Our lunchroom was in the basement of the school. And I remember we had 6 months, I think, was cooking class, and then the other part of the class, no, first we had sewing. And we had to make some kind of a costume to use for our cooking. And that's the first time I ever made popovers. That's all I can remember. Popovers. So,
It was very good because we could eat them after that.
yeah.
Not saying how clean it was, but
Well, don't hurt.
all I remember about the old 88, it seemed when I was a kid, big. it seemed enormous. And then later on, I had to deliver work there. And I walked in and I said, oh, it's so tiny. Such a tiny building. It was so wainscoting all over. Dark, very dark. That's all I remember of it.
Okay.
So, you're next. Did they pass you in grades? Did you get a failing grade?
I failed kindergarten. I started kindergarten in old 88. I didn't speak much English. My mother and father came from Czechoslovakia. At home they spoke Czech all the time. So I knew what kind of food there was. First thing I learned. Other words I didn't know what there was. Blanket, stuff like that. The kid took a nap. Well, I had no blanket. We come from a poor family. So I slept on the floor. The teacher came over there, you can't do it, can't do it. I know what she was talking about. And finally, it got through to me that I had to bring a blanket to school to sleep on. I wasn't allowed to sleep on the floor. And of course, I got raised a lot, and I got into a lot of fights and that because they used to always make fun out of me, and point at me and laugh. But that was all right. I learned, and I fought back. And that was my invitation to old 88. I went there till about the 4th grade, then I transferred to parochial school. My godmother was very much Catholic, and she said, you've got to get a good education. Which in public school, yes, but the language barrier didn't help me. There were no teachers there to help me out. But the nuns took time after school to try and help me, which was nice. And then I graduated from 8th grade, went to the old high school over here in Sayville. Then my freshman year, I quit and went to school. I went to work in a bow factory on Greene Avenue.
Yeah, by the railroad track.
Yeah. My father, he said, you gotta go back to school and finish school. So I did. I got some papers. I enlisted in the United States Navy. I was 17, but I had to get my parents' signature. So I said to my father, if you sign these papers, I'll go back to school. I didn't say what school. No. So he signed the paper, he was happy. And Lawyer Brown lived on Main Street, at the office on South Main. He found out, he went to see him. What can I do with him? Put him in jail or what? So there's nothing you could do. You signed the papers, he's in the Navy. That was it. That was, but there were no 88 burn, and we were there all day. And I think I'll tell you the story about that.
Say it again. Yeah. Tell us again.
It was, we were crying. It was snowing. One heck of a snowstorm we had that night. Slippery. And the metal ceilings that they put in, couldn't put the fire out because you couldn't get to the fire. You had to get a long pipe pole to put the ceiling down. And they're about 4 foot by 8 foot long. When you tear them down, you have to be careful. Because if you don't, you can cut somebody in half like. So that was the other job. It was a long night, but I went home about 10 o'clock that night and took a shower and went to bed right away. But that's my experience for 88. It was very good.
Thank you. Dr. Pollack.
My name is Emil Pollack. Have you identified yourself for the sake of the record? And Vera Weeks-Reichel.
Elizabeth Fossicker McLean.
Right. I attended the new elementary school, beginning in kindergarten with Priscilla Cleaver. I remember all these teachers, and was there through the 7th grade with the best of them all, Grace Schultz.
Oh, yes.
Then for the 8th grade, we had to be moved into old 88. And the teacher then was a Mr. Swift. His wife also taught for that year. He was also like Charlie Smith, the mechanics and carpentry and
Industrial
all.
arts.
How do you call this?
Industrial arts.
Industrial arts. Well, during that year, This was 48, 49, the academic year. During that year, there was a fire in Old 88 in the basement with the heating system. And we arrived the next morning, it was in the night, of course. We arrived the next morning and went into our classroom, and there were a few inches of water on the wooden floor. And I remember Swift complaining, "What's wrong with that Sayville Fire Department? Did they think the whole place was burning up? Look what they've done to this classroom." Do you happen to remember?
Yes.
It was minor, but for us students, it was major. And it was a very, very pleasant year that year. And then I went on to the high school here, 1949-50.
Actually, we had a lot of fog there upstairs. A
Right.
lot of smoke and that, a lot of heat. So just to keep things cool, we used a lot of fog, and that, of course, settled on the floor. Well,
But the building was spared, you know, we had our full year there. And of course, the others would follow.
I have one other quick story. The reason Sayville began hiring science teachers is because long ago, back in the '38 hurricane, they didn't have science teachers, or if they did, very few of them. And what they did, Old 88 didn't know about hurricanes, and the storm came along, and oh, it was bad. So they had, the children were drying clothes and everything else, but because they got awful wet coming to school. But came noontime. All of a sudden, the sun came out and it was clear. It tells me something. It was absolutely the center of the hurricane, but nobody in Old 88 knew that, so they sent all the children to walk home for lunch. Needless to say, they didn't come back, because by the time it was time to come back, the winds had increased again. And after that, they hired more science teachers.
One example of a science teacher appearing at that time was Edward Lyons.
Oh, he was the principal.
Yeah.
Well, here's an unprofessional statement. When Grace Schultz heard that Eddie Lyons was going to take over, she said, "It's time to retire."